So we covered the evolution of the federal bureaucracy. So we can kind of trace the history of it, the changes. So what is it like today? Well, today, the bureaucracy, if you want to go by strict definition, size, it has not changed a whole lot since the 1960s. This is something we have talked about several times in this class. If you look at the raw numbers, the number of federal employees has not changed very much since the 1960s. Those are people directly working for the government, people who get an actual paycheck from the United States government. That number really hasn't changed. So if a president were to, I've kept the bureaucracy small, they're sort of telling the truth. They've kept that number where it is. It's the number of indirect workers. Remember that proxy government stuff that we talked about earlier in this chapter? That number has exploded. Okay? There are still roughly 2 million federal workers, just like there were in 1960. But everyone forgets to mention the 13 million indirect workers, people who either partially or fully have their income paid for by the federal government, but they don't actually get a federal government check. One that I can give off the top of my head, Blackwater. Blackwater was a security company. They were the people that were providing security at Benghazi. If you are a security guard, for lack of a better term, if you are an operator for Blackwater, you get a check from Blackwater. Blackwater gets paid a contract from the federal government. So you are getting paid by the federal government, but you're not getting paid directly from the federal government. You're getting paid indirectly from the federal government. The only reason you have a job as a security operator is because Blackwater has a contract from the federal government. So nobody takes that into account when they do their math. Everybody's like, oh, the number of federal employees has stayed static for 50, 60 years. Direct federal employment, right? Everybody forgets all the proxy government stuff that we were talking about previously. All right. Now, here you go. For every person who is directly paid by the federal government, it's estimated that there are 3 people who are being indirectly paid by the federal government, earning their entire income, I should say. All right. Now, and if you look, here you go, chart time. There you go. Number of employees, right, in the executive branch hasn't changed very much since the 60s. A little shade under 2 million, all right. In the early 2000s, shade under 2 million. Looks like the government bureaucracy peaked in the 70s, early 70s, under Richard Nixon, and has fallen a little bit below that high water mark. But we've kind of danced around the 2 million employee mark for quite some time. Basically since the Eisenhower years. So everyone's forgetting to take into account all the other employees that we've added to the system. And I do want to point out too, you can't just use the number of employees as a measure of the impact of bureaucracy, because that's the other thing. People want to equate size as the ultimate measure of the influence, the power, the problem, however you want to term it. Size of a bureaucracy doesn't matter. You can have a massive bureaucracy. It could be an effective bureaucracy, right? Size does not guarantee that it's going to be this helpless quagmire. Also, a small bureaucracy is not a powerless institution either, right? It all has to do with what is called discretionary authority. But before I go to that, I do want to touch upon this chart. Here you go. This shows you how some of these institutions stayed pretty much the same. Some of them had minor cuts. I realized there was no Homeland Security in 1990. What they are doing in this calculation is they are taking all of the agencies that are now under the auspice of Homeland Security, and they are compiling that number. So don't think that these people just invented something that didn't exist. They were able to calculate how many people worked in all the things that became Homeland Security. There you go. You'll notice the one dramatic cut, Department of Defense. Cold War, no Cold War. Cold War, no Cold War, right? Also, no government by proxy, a lot of quote unquote contractors, right? Where we send people to guard the oil fields of Iraq, but they're not actually American Marines. They're, people working for a security firm. So, yes, we have dramatically cut back the number of civilian employees at the Department of Defense, but we are not counting all the private contractors, government by proxy. I would assume that this number is the same, if not maybe a little more than what it was in 1990 when you add in all the other folks that don't count as a direct employee of the Department of Defense. I'd like to point out, Justice Department, the growth here is not because the Justice Department was looking to, become larger. Your book mentioned the Bureau of Prisons, the BOP. The Bureau of Prisons is in charge of managing America's federal correction institutions, and there are roughly 200 facilities. They range from supermax facilities, like the one that we use in Colorado and Florida for people, convicted of espionage in the Cold War and stuff, to, minimum security things. Well, the problem is the prison population in our country doubled in these years, right? Especially federal. If anyone's curious, drug charges. If you want to look at what has brought about a lot of problem for America's prison system, it's the war on drugs. The number of people incarcerated in this country has grown staggeringly. And your issue is, a lot of times things become a federal charge because you drove across a state line with it in the car, or the amount, or whatever, right? The whole trafficking charge, the amount of drugs you got busted with qualifies you for trafficking, right? And we talked about with the Justice Department, or the Justice Branch, I should say, Judiciary Branch, they are going to charge you where they can get the most likely conviction and the stiffest penalty. And federal charges generally come with a stiffer penalty. And so what has happened, sorry to get off track so far, the Bureau of Prison population more than doubled between 1990 and 2013, which means the Bureau of Prisons had to double its staff, and the Bureau of Prisons was a decent chunk of the Justice Department's payroll. And so that's part of it. It wasn't that these people just were like, oh, yeah, we're going to do this. Basically, we just kept throwing more prisoners at them, and they had to increase. So this is an example of kind of a reluctant growth. Veterans Bureau, this growth is the result of the wars in the Middle East, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, all the people who now qualify for veterans benefits, VA hospitals, all that stuff. Again, there was a growth that no one was looking to have, but it was the result of situations. Now, size doesn't matter on these, though, as I was trying to say. Sorry. Back to, it's called discretionary authority, right? If you have a building full of people who just type the paper of the person next to them, you have a gigantic bureaucracy that does nothing, right? On the other side of the coin, you can have a institution made up of 50 people, but if it has all sorts of ability to create regulations, to enforce regulations, to issue injunctions, that is a more powerful bureaucracy, okay, or agency. And so your book calls discretionary authority the extent to which appointed bureaucrats can choose courses of action and make policies not spelled out in advance by law. Their ability to make decisions in those gray areas that are created between the law code and the authority of an agency, etc. That's your issue, right? That's what you really have to look at. Now, the volume of regulations is kind of the telling factor. Look at the number. Okay, this is how much government spending we've had, right? This is government spending. Hello, 1980s. Hello, early 2000s. Now, actually, hello, everything since 1980. But the amount of government spending on these agencies has grown dramatically. Their workforce hasn't grown. Look at what has exploded. Regulations, right? Look at all the rules and regulations and red tape. Here's looking at you, Jimmy Carter. But you can see in 1968, when Richard Nixon became president, roughly 20,000 pages of federal regulations in the Federal Register, right? 20,000 pages. By 1978, that number had gone over 60,000. So in 10 years, we had more than tripled the amount of regulations. And regulations peaked right before or right after Ronald Reagan's election at over 80,000 pages. So we quadrupled. In 12 years, we quadrupled the number of regulations, federal regulations. Now, there was a massive effort to trim that back, but as you see, it has crept back up. Crept back up. I apologize. And that is a great way to measure the influence and discretionary power of some of these agencies. The fact that they keep on passing regulations that affect us, right? And these aren't laws passed by Congress. These are rules and regulations that are generally coming out of these agencies or institutions, right, that make up the bureaucracy. Now, in what areas do these people have a lot of discretionary authority? Paying subsidies to particular groups and organizations. Your book gave examples like veterans, schools, universities, hospitals, right? You qualify for a program. Well, they determine you qualify for a program, you get the money, right? There is obviously a qualification system. There are rules and regulations that govern who gets what and how much and when. But obviously, someone has to go through the file and make sure everything works, that all the T's are crossed, all the I's are dotted, everything's legitimate. And if there's any question mark, these people are the ones who basically make the ruling. It doesn't go to court. And so that is one form of power, the ability to provide federal subsidies. Okay. Now, a second major way is transference of federal funds to state and local governments. You already learned about this, grants and aid, right? Those grants from the federal government that we learned all about early on in chapter 3 of this class. That's another form of discretionary authority. And as I was saying, creating and enforcing the regulations, right? I want to point out this was not very common until the New Deal. So the first one didn't really exist in the early days of our bureaucracy, right? The grants have been around forever, but those had fairly clear rules on them, right? It wasn't until the 1930s and the Supreme Court and the New Deal all kind of came together that the subsidy concept became more common and is here to stay. But it is this, the regulations and rules, that is really the one that I think most people have the most interaction with and generally the most complaints about, right? You want to operate a radio station, right? You want to have and not some like online streaming, like you want an old school transmitter radio station. You have to get that approved by the FCC, okay, the Federal Communications Commission. They have all sorts of rules and regulations, and if you break them, they're going to fine you, and they could charge you with crimes and all sorts of other stuff. Eventually, you know, these rules determine, as I was saying, who gets a radio or TV station. That your car has to have an airbag, whether you want to pay for that airbag or not, right? Whether you want one in your car or not, they're telling you you're going to have one in your car, right? Well, they're telling the auto manufacturer they will put one in your car, which means you will pay for one in your car. They determine which drugs can be sold in the United States and can't be sold in the United States, right? The FDA. The FDA has an immense amount of control over the medical devices and treatments and such that are available to the public. It's why, you know, there are sometimes drugs that they're using in Europe for several years before anyone in America can get their hands on them because the FDA has all these codes and rules and guidelines and testing, etc. My father is actually taking a drug that is in FDA trials right now for a heart condition. I think it's something that they've been using in Europe, but it's not been approved here. But fortunately, he qualified for an FDA trial. And so it's all, and it doesn't have to be that life threatening of a situation, right? It could be something as mundane as what the label has to look like on your bag of Doritos, right? That little nutritional label on the back that tells you the calories and the carbs and the protein and all that, right? Those are rules, right? Somebody had to sit down and write up the rules for what has to go on that label and how that label shall be designed and what the font will be. Think about it. Someone had to determine what's an acceptable font. What will be the font for the nutritional label? That's a federal rule, right? That's a reg. That's not optional. That's not up to the good people at Frito-Lay or whoever makes Doritos, right? And so that is discretionary authority, right? Because there's no law. Somebody just went up one day and was like, you know, I like Calabrini or whatever it is, 10 point. There you go. That's the rule. All the manufacturers in the country now have to figure out a way to put that on their product. Now, if these people have so much control over money and rules and regulations, we probably should find out who we're dealing with. And as your book noted, the behavior of these people will be affected by four broad factors. First of all, where are they coming from in the sense of how they get their job? How were they recruited? How do they keep their job? How do they earn promotion? What will get them fired? All that stuff will help determine how they behave. Let's face it. If their job was easy and it's really hard to it was easy to get, it's really hard to lose, they're not exactly going to be, a real go-getter, more than likely. You know, oh, it's a good paycheck. I didn't really have to fight to get this, and the rules make it near impossible for me to get fired, right? Like I'm like some ultra tenured official. You're really not going to be all, ooh, let's go change the world. Or if it's a sweet job, but it requires high performance and you can be removed at the drop of a hat, you might be very aggressive. Or you might be very cautious because you're afraid of making a mistake. I don't know, but that does play in, right? So the manner in which people get there and get promoted is a factor. We do have to take into account who they are, right? Their background. Um, the nature of the job, obviously. Is it a job that involves a lot of decision making? Is it a more routine, mundane job? And then we have to talk about the constraints. Who do they report to? Who are they trying to serve? How much media criticism will they face? How much congressional oversight will they face? All those things. So let's start to talk about these a little bit. Let's look at how one gets recruited for a federal job. The federal system over the years became a more competitive system. Okay, it's called the competitive service. Most, not all, most people get their job via the competitive service, and it's not near what it once was. The competitive service, gentlemen, in 1952, about 86% of all civil servants in the federal government went through the competitive service program. In 1996, the figure had dropped to about 54%. And I think it still is below 60%, but it's still over half, if I remember correctly. What does competitive service mean? All right, competitive service means that you had to, first of all, pass a written exam that was created by the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, or you met certain requirements, educational requirements, experience requirements, whatever. Okay. So you had to take it. There were certain requirements you maybe had to meet, and there might have been good chance that there was some sort of exam you had to take. Now, in jobs that require that, what they generally do is they take the top three scorers and they will pick one of those top three. That was the general rule of thumb, that they would choose from the top 3 applicants based on their testing standards, etc. Right? And that's how you get your job, your appointment, your position. But I just said the system has become less prevalent than it once was. All right? In recent years, each agency has started to kind of replace the examination and OPM system with their own kind of rules and standards. Why? First of all, the OPM standard was like a one-size-fits-all, and that doesn't really work. And when I say that, I mean it was like for everybody in the, let's just say, the Department of Interior, right? They had all these standards and rules and regulations and tests and exams, and it's like people on the left side of the hall had to take the same test as the people on the right side of the hall, but they had very different jobs in the Department of Interior, and it didn't really make sense, right? It just didn't work. It wasn't giving us the people we really needed to get. It was getting us people who did well on a certain test, but they might not have exactly the skills that we needed. That ties into the second issue. It started to become where we needed people who you really can't test. We need lawyers. We need scientists. We need engineers. And you can't use some standardized exam really on some of these people. Why? Because, you know, a person who went to law school and is a practicing lawyer, I mean, theoretically speaking, they all have the same basic knowledge. If you just give them a test on law, they should all score very well. Okay? Same thing with scientists. You get a bunch of biologists, right? A bunch of microbiologists. I would hope that they all score very highly on the test that's all about microbiology. They know the science. The issue is, what do we need the scientist to actually do? That, and you can't always test that, right? Same thing with the lawyer. You can't just give some facts-based test to determine, are they going to be able to do the job? I know that somebody, if we were in class, would go, so why do we have tests in school? We are testing your general knowledge. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm asking you to actually show me that you know the information. That was what people said about the government, though. You're basically asking people, do you know info? Anyone can know info. The question is, can you apply it? Can you use it? What other skill sets do you have? You know, you could lock a person in a room and teach them everything on the planet Earth about a certain subject. Doesn't mean they're going to be good as a bureaucrat. What if they have no people skills? What if they don't know how to convey their information, right? That sort of issue. And so the testing system didn't work for certain employees that we needed. And thirdly, the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s began to push for a racial composition in the federal bureaucracy that resembled America's racial makeup a little more. People began to point out the federal government was awful Caucasian, more so than the United States as a whole was. And so there was a push for, you need to actually use some other standards or methods to try and get some people in the federal government. And again, too, there were other changes, okay? One that I actually am a little more familiar with, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the organization that was created during the Nixon years, late 60s, early 70s. And it was to create safety rules for construction, basically, in the workplace. Well, you need people who actually do that. So they had to go get people who were welders and iron workers and pipe fitters and mechanics and people who built scaffolding and actually ask them about, what do you do? How do you do? You know, write a report, explain us, walk it through. So the changing needs of the federal bureaucracy dictated that, again, you would go get people, or you needed to go get people who you really can't test. Right? I mean, testing would serve you no purpose. It would not help you in getting what you needed. And so, especially with OSHA, you know, you got to get people who actually do this stuff. You can't go get a random guy in Washington, D.C. and be like, hey, I need you to write rules on pouring concrete. And the person goes, what's concrete? You got to get a person who pours concrete, right? And I don't think that that guy is necessarily going to be the kind of guy that's going to take a standardized test for you. You know, when they wrote, I know a lot about this because I actually taught safety classes. I taught OSHA safety classes for a while to get people OSHA certifications. And I mean, they do. They have all these rules. And having worked in the industry as an iron worker, I can tell you there are all sorts of rules and regulations about when you go up on the steel, what you're supposed to be doing, how you're supposed to be doing, etc. Those were written. Some of those were actually composed by men who did the job, who said, yeah, this would work or this won't work. You know, they would propose regulations. Somebody's got to go, that's not practical, dude. And let me tell you why. And again, it's not something you can test. Now, that's not to say, so there are people who don't take a test. They are what is called exempted service. Excuse me. You've got competitive service for a lot of the lower level positions. There are also lower level positions that do not take the test. Okay? They are not part of the competitive service. And then you have, okay, exempted service. Okay, now these tend to be higher up. Competitive is lower level, exempted service is usually the higher ups. First of all, you've got those people that are appointed via the president by statute. So, judges, cabinet members, U.S. attorneys, ambassadors, okay? Basically, these are the high-level positions which were created by law, and the president has to fill them, and there's usually some sort of Senate confirmation process or whatever. There's somebody that goes through and confirms them, right? These aren't people the president just calls up and they get a job. Usually somebody's got to sign on the dotted line. There is what is called a Schedule C appointment. C stands for confidential. These are appointments that are described as having a confidential or policy determining character. So you're not a cabinet member, but you might be a special assistant, a special aide, a confidential secretary, the kind of person who's going to work with sensitive material. And so you're going to get your position not through some test, but you will have to pass a background check, all sorts of other things. There are other requirements, but again, it's not something we can necessarily make you take a test for. And then there is the non-career executive assignment. High-ranking members of the competitive civil service will sometimes be promoted into these positions. And these are people who are going to work more closely with some of these upper-level folks, basically. Now, all three of these groups have become a large group. In 1961, President Kennedy had 451 jobs that he could fill. President Barack Obama had more than 4 times that number when he showed up, right? And so, you know, this has become a form of patronage for the president. These jobs right here, these are 1,500 or so jobs the president can dole out with some degree of flexibility. Speaking of patronage, we have tried to do away with a lot of patronage. Patronage used to be a big part of the game, right? When Grover Cleveland became the first Democratic president in quite some time in 1885, he replaced 40,000 postal workers, Republicans, with Democrats, right? That's kind of strange because in 1883, the Pendleton Act had been passed. The Pendleton Act was the first attempt at real civil service reform. It was an attempt to limit the patronage spoil system and replace it with a merit-based system, one where you had to earn your position. Why did this occur? Well, first of all, everybody knew how President Garfield got assassinated by a deranged office seeker, an insane guy who one of his arguments was, I was mad because nobody gave me a job and I helped him win the election. Everyone was like, wow. Another reason, though, interestingly, Republicans who had had a stranglehold on power realized one day they would be out of power. There was no way the Republicans were going to win the presidency for the rest of time. And they were afraid that if they did not come up with a way to avoid outright patronage, as soon as a Democrat won, they'd all lose their jobs. And so in 1883, they basically passed the Pendleton Act to start the process of creating a competitive system, a merit-based system. Unfortunately for them, not a whole lot of the changes had gone into effect yet, so when Grover Cleveland took the presidency, he was able to fire a bunch of Republicans willy-nilly. But the merit-based system, gentlemen, has become a part of our system. Now, I mentioned constraints. And this is the last thing we'll touch on this section. Constraints. What do we mean? These are the limitations, the rules, right, that limit what a agency or a bureaucrat can do. And since we're talking about the actual employees, let's just say an actual bureaucrat, an actual employee. What can they do? How far can they go? What is their discretionary authority? So those are what we call constraints. Now, some of these might set the limit to the size or the minimum size of an agency, right? When it comes to hiring and firing, there might actually be a rule that says you can't have fewer than X number of employees in this department. And even though you want to cut cost and cut overhead, and you know that McCoy guy down the hall doesn't do anything and you could easily fire him, you can't because of the rules. You can't go below a certain number, right? Now, if they change the rule, you can, but they'd have to change that constraint. Those are examples, though. Those are real things the federal government has to deal with, that the bureaucracy has to deal with. Some of the ones that affect everybody. Your book listed some, but for example, the Freedom of Information Act. Citizens have the right to access all government records except those involving basically confidential or secret information. There's privacy acts, there's the open meeting law, all sorts of rules that kind of govern how the bureaucracy will conduct itself, how information will be stored, how it will be recorded, how it will be available. Excuse me. The big constraint I would like to point out is that typically there is overlap, right? No one group is doing one job, right? For example, let's talk about drugs. Who is in charge of stopping drugs in this country? Some of you would say, sir, that's the FBI. Right. But what about the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA? Oh, them too. What about the Coast Guard? Them too. What about Border Patrol? Them too. Customs? Yeah. They actually inspect the vehicles that come into this country and the ships that come in this country. They're part of that. Does the Department of Defense help? They can. They sometimes do. And so my point is, the war on drugs is not a DEA or FBI thing. It's Homeland Security. It's Border Patrol. It's Coast Guard. It's all sorts of people. And that means that sometimes you've got multiple people all going at the same problem, using up funding, stepping on each other's toes, getting in the way. Your book gave the other example of, when there was the financial crisis in 2007. You had a bunch of different agencies that were responsible for determining who qualified for a bailout, who qualified for this, who qualified for that. There was the troubled asset. TARP. What was TARP? TARP was the Troubled Asset Relief Program, right? So you've got all these different groups basically kind of fighting each other to do their job, and it makes things difficult and tricky. Now, what is the overall effect of constraints? Well, the overall effects are, first of all, the government is going to act slowly. The more constraints, the longer it takes to get anything done. The more paperwork that has to be filed. The more checks you have to go through, right? Constraints are basically, if I could give you a metaphor, think of how we make a law. Think of all the steps we had to go through to make a law. Those are constraints, right? Think about it. Those are examples of constraints. It's got to be proposed. It's got to go to committee. It's got to go to subcommittee. It's got to be voted on by the committee. Then it's got to go to the floor debate. Then it's got to be voted on. Then it goes to the other chamber. Same concept with bureaucracy, okay? They've got all sorts of forms and levels and hoops, etc. If you ever want to have a fun day, go to a government office and have something that you need to get done. And enjoy walking around the building, okay? Because you're going to be told after you go to the first office, well, you're going to have to go up to the third floor, and and they've got to sign it, and then they'll send you to the next person. Oh, here you go. I go to pay your vehicle taxes, right? You go to pay your vehicle taxes. Where I live in Boone County, we got like 2 government buildings in Boone County. You go to pay your vehicle taxes in one building,
And it turned out I needed to get a new driver's license at the very same time. I had to go across the street to a special area of the courthouse across the street to get my driver's license. The people who take care of your vehicle taxes, they aren't even in the same building as the people who take your picture for the driver's license, right? I mean, that's an example of some of the constraints in bureaucracy. The government will act inconsistently, because of all these constraints. Some of them violate each other, like some of them make you do things that seem counter. On one hand, we've got all these Freedom of Information Acts, right? All these laws about how you and I have access to government records and government documents and government meetings. Wait a minute, except if it involves security or a trade secret, and then it's covered up, right? Or yeah, I should say covered up. It's not accessible to the public, right? So government has one constraint that says one thing and then another constraint that says another, and it depends on which one supersedes and all that stuff. It's far easier to block action than to take action, much like it's far easier to stop a law than pass a law. Having all these constraints means you've got to walk through this minefield, and it's easy to get blown up in that minefield, so to speak. I will say that government employees are loath to make any decision. All these constraints means it's easy to make a mistake. If you're a government employee, it's easy for you to make a wrong decision because there's all these rules and regulations you're supposed to be following. And it's easy to get confused, and it's easy to get lost. And it's easy for you to just kick it to your boss. Just go to their office and hand them the file and go, I don't know what to do. What should I do? And then make them do it. Right? And we will obviously complain about it because no one likes filling out forms. No one likes standing in line. No one likes waiting. No one enjoys any of that. And so we're going to complain. We're going to dislike it. I do want to go ahead and end with pointing out, this is not the fault of the government employees necessarily. Okay? I am not saying that the people who work at the government are bumbling morons. All right? They are people, many of them, quite qualified, doing their job. But the problem is the constraints that are placed upon them keep them from doing things the way they might want to do them or the way you might want them to do them. They're having to work in a very complex environment with a very strict set of rules and regulations, and it makes life difficult. I will share a story very quickly from my life, and this is not made up. Years ago, my wife went to the post office when our son was very, very young, like car seat young, like the thing you carry around, right? The little baby carrier. And my wife went into the post office and did her business in the post office and went back to her car to put our son in the car and all. And what she did was she first took off her purse and she threw her purse down on the passenger seat. Her keys were in her purse, right? Her key remote. I guess the way the things in her purse moved, it hit the lock button. She didn't realize it. She closed the door. All of a sudden, her car was locked. She had locked her keys in her car in the parking lot of the post office. She's got a, 6-month-old in her arms, right? I think it was about 9 months, really. Anyhow, my wife had locked herself and our son out of the car. She's in the post office parking lot. She goes into the post office. She asks if she can use the phone to call me so I can go get a key and stuff, right? Because her phone was in her purse. The guy at the desk told her, I can't let you use the phone. It's against the rules. Now, I'm not saying that this guy is a heartless human being, but that's the rule at the post office, that people cannot use the phone at the post office. It's only for postal employees, right? I mean, the woman is standing there with a baby, an infant, right? I mean, it's not like she's just going to go have a chit chat for fun. She says, I need to call my husband. I'm locked down in my car. This, that, the. I have no way of communicating with anybody, right? I just need to call and when he said, I can't let you do it. Then she said, can you do it? I'll give you my husband's phone number. You can call him. No, I can't, because this is for postal business only. The rule states this phone may only be used for postal business. my wife obviously was upset and started to cry, honestly, because she didn't know what she was going to do. Eventually, another worker at the post office, she said, "Here's my cell phone. Call your husband." I don't know why that male postal worker didn't think about that one. I eventually found out about this and was not happy, and I will say I have never forgiven the post office. No, I haven't actually. I'm still mad about it, but it's not their fault. They didn't write the rules, and you know what? Had that guy let my wife use the phone, and if one of his coworkers had turned him in, he'd have gotten in trouble. He'd have gotten in trouble because that's the rules, right? I'm not happy with how that guy acted, but that guy was doing what he had to do to protect his job, to avoid a write-up in his file, to maybe guarantee that he was eligible for promotion the next time, right? That is an example of constraints, okay? When you complain about government employees, when you complain about the way the bureaucracy works, those people don't write the rules that they have to operate under, okay? They are just having to live and work in an environment of someone else's dictate. So let's keep that in mind the next time we complain about our government workers.